Objective 38 is about the molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which allows the cell to store energy and is also used as an energy currency. So regardless of what sort of energy requiring process the cell needs to go through, it uses the molecule ATP in order to carry out that process. We'll take a look at the molecular structure of ATP in a model of the ATP molecule in this inserted movie. This is the adenosine triphosphate molecule. Remember that adenosine consists of an adenine group. In this part of the molecule, adenine is a two-ring structure, so we see one ring here, one ring here. And then the adenosine part, the part that makes it O-S-I-N-E on the end, is that it has a ribose sugar attached to it. So that ribose sugar is found in this region of the molecule here. The business end of this adenosine triphosphate molecule are these three phosphate groups that give it its name. That's why it's called triphosphate. Notice that each one of these phosphorus atoms is a pale yellow color here. That each one of the phosphorus atoms has a number of oxygens attached to it. That's what makes it a phosphate. Recall from our study of functional groups that a phosphorus with 3 or 4 oxygens on it is a phosphate group. So you have one phosphate group here, one here, one here, and each of the phosphate groups is bridged by another oxygen atom in between the phosphate groups. If we want to release energy from this molecule, we could go and remove all 3 of the phosphate groups, but in reality we don't do that. We just remove the terminal phosphate group, we remove the one on the end. So if we need to release energy, and we'll hear that as a pop as I release this bond, then we release energy in this way. This leaves us with adenosine diphosphate, 1, 2 phosphate groups. So this is adenosine diphosphate. If, on the other hand, we have extra energy and we want to store that energy for use later in ATP, this energy currency of the cell, in this adenosine triphosphate molecule, then we store energy by reforming this bond here. And when we form that bond, energy is stored and can be released later on. This slide, again from Module 2, Objective 4, shows us where the energy from ATP comes from and where the energy from ATP goes into. So anytime we have an anabolic reaction where we have to supply the energy, that energy that's supplied comes from ATP, from adenosine triphosphate, comes from the high energy bonds between the second and the third phosphate group of the ATP molecule. Almost every time that we have a reaction that releases energy, we want to store that energy for later use, and when we want to store energy for later use or for use in another location or use in another set of chemical reactions, then we do that by using the energy currency of ATP. We take adenosine triphosphate, we add a phosphate group onto the end of it, and in doing so we store that energy for later use, and that's why ATP is the energy currency. So when a reaction requires energy, the energy comes from ATP. When a reaction releases energy, the energy oftentimes goes into ATP. Looking at a drawn-out structure of ATP then, and you want to be able to move interchangeably between this kind of drawn-out atomic structure and the model that we saw in the earlier movie, then we saw these high-energy bonds between the phosphate group. In this drawing, they're represented as squiggles. And the bonds that are represented by these squiggles are the difference between adenosine diphosphate with 2 phosphate groups and adenosine triphosphate with 3 phosphate groups. So 1 mole of ATP molecules can be converted into 1 mole of ADP and 1 mole of phosphate ions, and in doing so we release 35 kilojoules of energy. This is the energy that's released that can be used in chemical reactions and other cellular processes. So this is just to remind you of the model that we looked at in the little inserted movie, that between the second and the third phosphate group, this high energy bond is either broken if we want to release energy, or it's formed if we want to store energy. Digestion is to convert large molecules into small molecules. The small molecules are then converted into glucose, and then the glucose is made into ATP inside of cells. The way in which glucose is made into ATP we'll see at the end of Module 4. This brings us to the different forms of cellular energy that we have. We have electrical energy, which is used in nerve impulses. We have heat energy, which comes out of chemical reactions inside of cells. We have mechanical energy that comes from muscle contractions. We have potential energy that's tied up in energy-rich covalent bonds, such as those in the ATP molecule. We have radiant energy, which is not important in humans because humans aren't able to photosynthesize, but plants are, and so they use that form of cellular energy. So this goes back to something we talked about in Module 2 when we talked about the difference between potential and kinetic energy. Another way of saying this is that ATP is a molecule that is full of potential energy. And when we utilize the potential energy that's inside of the ATP molecule, we can turn that into kinetic energy. In the last two objectives in this module, Objective 39 and Objective 40, we want to look at the trace molecules and the trace atoms that occur in the human body that don't fit easily into any one of these other categories. So this is just sort of the leftover bin for things that don't fit easily into the 4 main categories of biomolecules that we looked at earlier. In Objective 39, we have vitamins. We've already talked about the fat-soluble vitamins in brief, and we're going to add in water-soluble vitamins. We don't need to know all of them at this point in the course. There'll be plenty of opportunities to learn more of them later on and also in other courses. The 4 vitamins that we need you to know the class of and the signs of human deficiency for the exam are vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin D, and vitamin K. So in each case, for each of these vitamins, you need to know what class it fits into. Is it fat-soluble or water-soluble? And you also need to know what happens in human disease if a diet is deficient in these vitamins, or if the person becomes unable to make or absorb these different vitamins. Vitamins are important because they're cofactors in enzymatic reactions. We looked at enzymes earlier. Vitamins oftentimes act as cofactors to help this enzyme to do its job. Notice this cofactor is helping the enzyme fold into a shape which is going to interact with the substrates in a way that will help to catalyze this chemical reaction. The last objective, Objective 40, is about a few minerals that are found in the human body. These are the same as the chemical elements that we talked about earlier, and so this is not so much new information as expanding the information that we had already. We talked about the element fluorine. Fluorine has an important function in maintaining the structure of teeth and bones. If humans are deficient in fluorine, then they have an increased incidence of cavities or dental caries. They also have an increased incidence of osteoporosis. The next element that we'll look at is chromium. Chromium is important for the use of insulin in the human body. Insulin is used in ways that we'll look at later to help to manage glucose, carrying glucose from the blood to the tissues of the body. If humans are deficient in chromium, then they can have an insulin resistance type syndrome. They can have an impaired glucose tolerance and elevated serum lipids. Iron is a chemical element which functions in oxygen and electron transport. We saw it as an important constituent of the heme group of hemoglobin, so it interacts with oxygen molecules, and this is the way in which hemoglobin acts as an oxygen carrier. If we're deficient in iron, then the blood is not able to carry enough oxygen to the tissues, and we have a disease called anemia. Iodine is an important chemical element, which, as I said earlier, is a constituent of thyroid hormones. So a deficiency of iodine can lead to goiter, which is an enlarged thyroid, can depress thyroid function. So if it happens before or at the time of birth, then we call it congenital. And if the lack of thyroid hormone is congenital, then it can result in a syndrome called cretinism, which is mental retardation and characteristic physical signs and a lower metabolism.